I never thought I'd be the guy telling a story like this. You know, the one about a marriage that fell apart in the most blindsiding, soap opera way imaginable. But here I am, and honestly, I still can't fully wrap my head around how it all unraveled. When I met Sarah, she was everything I'd ever wanted. Funny, smart, driven. We clicked instantly. After dating for a little over a year, I proposed, and she said yes. Our wedding was small but perfect. We had dreams, plans, all those cozy little conversations about the future that make you feel invincible. Kids were always part of the plan. She'd gush about how she wanted 2, maybe 3, and we'd spend hours talking about baby names and what our lives would look like in 10 years. The first couple of years of our marriage felt like a honeymoon phase that never really ended. Sure, we had our disagreements, every couple does, but overall, we were happy. Or at least, I thought we were. After about a year of trying to start a family without any success, we decided to get checked out. The results came back, and the news hit me like a truck. The problem was me. My fertility was way below average, and the chances of us conceiving naturally were close to 0. I felt like someone had punched me in the gut and then ripped out my insides for good measure. Sarah was there, holding my hand while we sat in the doctor's office. She squeezed it, smiled softly, and said, "It's okay. We'll figure it out. I'm with you no matter what." At the time, I believed her. But looking back, I should have noticed the shift almost immediately. In the beginning, she still talked about kids, but less and less over time. Then she stopped bringing it up entirely. Whenever I'd try to suggest alternatives, adoption, surrogacy, she'd shut it down quickly with some vague comment about how it wasn't the right time. She started focusing on other things. She was always on her phone, always had some new work friend she'd casually mention in passing. Our conversations became surface level. She was either too busy or too tired to talk about anything meaningful. I told myself it was just a phase, that we'd bounce back eventually. But deep down, I could feel her slipping away. The little digs started next. Comments about how I'd put on weight or how I wasn't motivated enough in my career. They came out of nowhere, like tiny needles jabbing at my self-esteem. Sarah had never been like that before. One night, after she made a snide remark about how I'd let myself go, I finally asked her outright, "What's going on with you? You've been so distant lately." She looked at me, sighed, and said, "You're imagining things. Everything's fine." But everything wasn't fine. We kept drifting further apart. Our marriage turned into this cold, distant arrangement where we barely even felt like friends, let alone husband and wife. I wanted to fix it. I really did. But every time I tried to bring us back to what we used to be, she'd pull away even more. Then, out of nowhere, she told me she was planning a trip with some of her girlfriends. They were going to Europe, she said. A week away to clear her head and recharge. I didn't think much of it at first. Sarah had taken girls' trips before, and I'd always encouraged her to have her own space and time with her friends. I helped her pack, double-checked her passport, and even drove her to the airport. Before she walked through security, she turned back to me with this soft smile and said, "Thank you for being so supportive." That stuck with me. It felt off, but I brushed it aside. That night, I stayed up late, waiting for her to land and check in. I kept refreshing the flight tracker, pacing around the house, trying to keep myself busy. Her flight landed, and I called. No answer. I figured she was tired and had gone straight to bed. The next morning, still nothing. I sent a few texts, called again, and got nothing but radio silence. By lunchtime, the pit in my stomach had grown into full-blown panic. I called her sister. Nothing. Called a couple of her friends, thinking maybe she was just caught up in sightseeing. But that's when I hit the wall. One of her friends sounded genuinely confused when I asked how the trip was going. "What trip?" she asked. I froze. My mouth went dry, and I couldn't find the words. "She's not with you?" I finally managed to choke out. "No," her friend said slowly. "We haven't planned anything. I haven't seen Sarah in weeks." I hung up and just sat there staring at the floor. My brain couldn't process what was happening. Sarah hadn't gone on any girl's trip. She wasn't in Europe. She wasn't with her friends. She was just gone. Every detail from the past few months started snapping into focus like shards of glass falling into place. The distance, the coldness, the weird way she'd thanked me at the airport. It was all part of her plan. She hadn't just left for a vacation. She had left me. For days, I was a mess. I couldn't eat, couldn't sleep, couldn't do anything but stare at my phone, waiting for some kind of message, some kind of explanation, but nothing ever came. Her family didn't know anything either. Her mom cried when I told her. Her dad tried to come up with logical reasons, like maybe Sarah was overwhelmed and needed time. But we all knew the truth. She had planned this. She had looked me in the eyes, kissed me goodbye, and walked away from our life together without a second thought. I spent weeks spiraling. Therapy helped a little, but the hole she'd left behind felt impossibly big. Friends tried to distract me, but I couldn't focus on anything except the question looping through my head. Why? Why would she do this to me? Eventually, the anger started to set in. The sadness, the confusion. It all morphed into this burning rage. I wasn't just hurt. I was furious. How could someone I loved so deeply, someone I built my life around, just walk away like that? But anger wasn't going to bring her back. Nothing would. So I started rebuilding. Slowly, painfully, but steadily. And just when I thought I had finally closed that chapter of my life, she came back. And she wasn't alone. When I opened the door and saw Sarah standing there, it felt like time stopped. She was holding a baby. A baby? Her hair was pulled back in a messy ponytail, her clothes looked worn, and there were dark circles under her eyes. But it was still her. The same woman who had kissed me goodbye at the airport all those years ago and disappeared without a trace. For a second, I thought I was dreaming, like my brain had conjured her up just to mess with me one last time. She smiled, a weak, uncertain smile, and said, "Hi, James." I couldn't move, couldn't speak. I just stood there in the doorway staring at her and the baby in her arms. After what felt like an eternity, I finally managed to say, "What are you doing here?" Her smile faltered, and she looked down at the baby, adjusting the blanket around him. "Can I come in, please? I need to talk to you." "No," I shook my head. "You can talk right here." Her eyes filled with something, sadness, regret, maybe shame. But I wasn't about to let her into my house, the place I had rebuilt for myself after she tore everything apart. She sighed and shifted the baby to her other arm. "Okay, that's fair." For a moment, neither of us said anything. It was just the sound of cars passing in the distance and the faint babbling of the baby. Finally, she started talking. "I know showing up like this is a lot, and I know I'm probably the last person you ever wanted to see again, but I had to come back. I had to explain." I crossed my arms over my chest. "Explain? You vanished. You lied to me, you left me, and now you're standing here with, what? Your kid? And you think you can just show up and explain?" She flinched at my words, her eyes glistening with tears. I know I don't deserve your time or your patience. But please, James, just hear me out." Against my better judgment, I stayed quiet and let her continue. She told me everything, or at least, everything she thought I deserved to know. She said she had left because she wanted a baby, and when she found out I couldn't give her one, something inside her broke. She said she felt trapped, resentful, and lost. That she couldn't face a life without children and couldn't face me knowing she'd have to let go of that dream. "So you ran," I said flatly. "Yes," she admitted softly. "I ran. I found someone else. Someone who could give me what I wanted." The way she said it made me sick to my stomach, like she was talking about ordering something off a menu. "But it didn't work out," she continued. He wasn't what I thought he'd be. He left as soon as he found out I was pregnant. And then it was just me, alone, with him." She glanced down at the baby. For a brief moment, I felt a flicker of sympathy, not for her, but for the child in her arms. He hadn't asked for any of this. He hadn't chosen to be part of her mess. But that sympathy didn't last long. "And now what?" I asked. "You show up here thinking what? That I'm just going to take you back? That I'll pretend none of this happened and we'll play house with your kid?" "No," she said quickly. "No, that's not, well, I mean, I don't know. I thought maybe we could try again. Start over." I let out a bitter laugh. "Start over? Sarah, you obliterated our life. You didn't just leave. You planned it. You lied to my face, walked out, and now you think you can waltz back in here with someone else's kid and call it a second chance? Her face crumpled, and tears started streaming down her cheeks. The baby stirred in her arms, letting out a soft whimper. I know I don't deserve forgiveness. I know I don't deserve you. But James, I've been so alone. And I realized too late what I'd done. I realized I'd thrown away the best thing I ever had. I couldn't listen to it anymore. The tears, the regret, it all felt hollow. Like she was only sorry because her plan hadn't worked out. Because the guy she'd chosen over me had bailed and left her holding the pieces. So what do you want from me? I asked finally. Why are you here? She hesitated. I thought maybe you'd want to meet him. Be a part of his life. That was it. That was the final straw. I shook my head and took a step back. No, absolutely not. He's not my child, Sarah. And you? You're not my wife anymore. You stopped being my wife the second you walked away. She started sobbing harder, her shoulders shaking as she tried to keep the baby calm. For a split second, I felt a pang of guilt, but I shoved it down. You made your choice, I said quietly, and now you have to live with it. I started to close the door, but she stepped forward, her voice rising in panic. Please, James, please don't shut me out. I don't have anyone else. You don't understand how hard it's been. But I did shut the door. I shut it right in her face, cutting off whatever else she had to say. And then I locked it. I stood there for a minute, my hand still on the doorknob, listening to her muffled cries from the other side. Eventually, they stopped. I heard her footsteps retreating, and then silence. When I finally turned away from the door, I felt empty. Not relieved, not triumphant, just empty. I walked to the kitchen, poured myself a drink, and sat down at the table. My hands were shaking, and my heart was pounding in my chest. Sarah was gone again. But this time, it was different. This time, I was the one who had closed the door. And as much as it hurt, I knew it was the right thing to do. The days after Sarah showed up felt like a foggy blur. I'd catch myself replaying every second of that conversation over and over in my head. Her face at the door, the baby in her arms, the way her voice cracked when she begged me to let her in. It was like a broken record looping in my brain. Part of me almost felt guilty, like maybe I'd been too harsh, too cold. But then I'd remind myself of everything she'd done, every lie she'd told, every night I'd spent alone wondering where she was. Any pity I had would evaporate just as quickly as it came. I didn't tell anyone she'd come back, not right away. It felt too surreal, too raw. I kept to myself, throwing myself into work and sticking to my routine like nothing had happened. But my mind wouldn't stop buzzing with questions. Why now? Why me? Did she really think she could just waltz back into my life after all these years, holding someone else's kid, and I'd just forgive her? Pretend none of it ever happened? One night, about a week later, my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. James, it's me. Please, just talk to me. I need to explain. Please. I stared at the screen for a long time. My thumb hovered over the keyboard, but I didn't reply. I didn't owe her anything, not anymore. Over the next few days, the messages kept coming. Sometimes they were long, rambling apologies. Other times they were short and desperate. I don't know what to do. Please, just one conversation. You're the only person I have left. At first, I ignored them. But eventually, curiosity got the better of me. I wanted answers, real answers. Not the teary-eyed sob story she tried to sell me on my doorstep. So, against my better judgment, I texted her back. Meet me at the diner on 5th tomorrow morning. 9 a.m. Don't bring the kid. The next morning, I got there early and grabbed a corner booth. The diner was mostly empty, just a couple of regulars hunched over their coffee mugs. I kept my eyes on the door, and when Sarah walked in, my stomach twisted into knots. She looked worn down. Her face was pale, her hair was pulled back into a messy bun, and her clothes looked like they'd been thrown on without much thought. But she still had that same nervous smile, like she was trying to gauge whether I'd bolt before she even sat down. Hey, she said softly, sliding into the seat across from me. I nodded but didn't say anything. The waitress came by, and Sarah ordered a coffee. I already had one in front of me, untouched and lukewarm. Once we were alone again, Sarah took a deep breath. "Thank you for meeting me," she said. "Get to the point," I replied flatly. "What do you want from me, Sarah?" She flinched but nodded. "Right. Okay. I owe you the truth. All of it." She started from the beginning. How she'd felt trapped after the infertility diagnosis. How every conversation about adoption or surrogacy felt like a reminder of what she couldn't have naturally. How she'd started resenting me, not because I'd done anything wrong, but because I was a symbol of the thing she wanted most but couldn't have. "It wasn't fair to you," she said, her voice trembling. "I know that, but I felt so stuck, like the walls were closing in on me." "So you left," I said bitterly. "Yes," she whispered. "I left. I met someone online, a guy who said all the right things at all the right times. He made me feel wanted, like everything I was missing was suddenly within reach. I told myself I deserved to be happy, even if it meant breaking everything we'd built together." She paused and stared into her coffee cup. "But he wasn't who I thought he was. As soon as I told him I was pregnant, he disappeared, blocked my number, vanished into thin air. And then it was just me. For a second, I almost felt bad for her. Almost. But then I remembered all those nights I'd spent sitting alone in our house, wondering if she was dead or alive. I remembered the humiliation of having to tell her family, her friends, everyone we knew, that she had just left. "So what now?" I asked. "What do you expect me to do with all this information, Sarah? Am I supposed to feel sorry for you? Am I supposed to swoop in and save you because life didn't turn out the way you planned?" She shook her head quickly. "No, James. I'm not asking you to fix anything. I'm not even asking you to forgive me. I needed you to know. I needed you to hear it from me." I leaned back in the booth and crossed my arms. "Okay, I've heard you. Are we done here?" Her eyes filled with tears again, and she nodded. "Yeah, I guess we are." She reached into her bag and pulled out a small envelope, sliding it across the table. "This is for you. Just read it when you have time." Without another word, she got up, left some cash on the table for her coffee, and walked out of the diner. I watched her go, her shoulders slumped, her head down, like the weight of the world was pressing down on her. I didn't open the envelope right away. I shoved it into my jacket pocket and left the diner. It wasn't until later that night, sitting alone in my living room, that I finally pulled it out. Inside was a handwritten letter. It was long and rambling, full of apologies and regrets. But one sentence stuck out to me. "I know I can't undo what I've done, but I hope someday you'll find it in your heart to forgive me, not for me, but for yourself." I folded the letter back up and set it aside. Forgiveness? I wasn't sure if I'd ever get there. But I did know one thing. I wasn't going to let her back into my life. Not now, not ever. Sarah had made her choice all those years ago. And now, I was making mine. A few weeks passed after that meeting at the diner, and Sarah slowly faded back into the background of my life. The texts stopped, the calls stopped. It was as if she'd finally accepted that whatever bridge she'd been trying to rebuild had already burned to ash. I should have felt relieved. I should have felt like a weight had been lifted off my chest, but instead, there was just silence. An emptiness that hung around like stale air in a closed-off room. I threw myself into work harder than ever. I stayed late at the office, volunteered for extra projects, and filled every spare moment with something productive. Anything to keep my mind from drifting back to her, back to the image of her standing on my doorstep with that baby in her arms. But no matter how hard I tried to push it down, it would always bubble back up. Her voice, her face, the tears in her eyes as she tried to explain herself. It haunted me. One Friday night, after an exhausting week, I found myself at home staring at the letter she'd given me. I'd already read it a dozen times, but I kept it on the coffee table like some kind of cursed artifact. Every time I picked it up, I tried to find some hidden meaning in her words, some clue about what I was supposed to do now. But there was nothing. Just her guilt, splattered across the page in ink. I told myself I'd moved on, but if I was being honest, I felt stuck. Frozen in place, trapped between anger and a strange, lingering sadness I couldn't shake. A few nights later, Just as I was finally starting to feel like I might be able to put this all behind me, I got another text, this time from Sarah's mom, Linda. James, I'm so sorry to bother you, but Sarah's been struggling. She's not doing well, and I don't know who else to reach out to. Could you please call me when you have a minute? I stared at the message for a long time. My first instinct was to ignore it. Whatever Sarah was going through wasn't my problem anymore. But Linda, she'd always been kind to me, even after Sarah left. She was one of the few people who had stuck around and checked in on me when everything fell apart. So, after a few minutes of internal debate, I called her. Linda picked up almost immediately. Her voice was shaky, and I could tell she'd been crying. She told me Sarah had moved back in with them after our encounter at the diner. She said Sarah wasn't eating much, wasn't sleeping, and had fallen into some kind of deep depression. The baby, whose name, I found out, was Liam, was being cared for mostly by Linda and her husband because Sarah could barely get out of bed most days. James, I know you don't owe her anything, Linda said softly, but if there's any chance you could just talk to her again, I think seeing you brought something to the surface, something she's been trying to bury for a long time. I closed my eyes and pinched the bridge of my nose. Every part of me was screaming no. I didn't owe Sarah anything. I had given her everything I had, and she had thrown it away. But Linda's voice cracked as she said, I just don't know how to help her anymore. Against every ounce of common sense I had left, I agreed to visit. The following Saturday, I drove to Sarah's parents' house. It was a modest, two-story place in a quiet neighborhood. I'd been there countless times when we were married. Holidays, Sunday dinners, birthdays. Walking up to the door felt like stepping into a time capsule. Linda opened the door and pulled me into a hug before I could say anything. She looked tired, older somehow, like the weight of the situation was aging her faster than time ever could. Thank you for coming, James. Really, she said softly. She led me into the living room, where little Liam was sitting on a play mat, gnawing on a plastic toy. He had Sarah's eyes, and for a brief moment, I felt my chest tighten. Linda must have noticed because she quickly said, She's upstairs. Second door on the left. I hesitated at the bottom of the staircase. Part of me wanted to turn around, walk out the door, and never look back. But I forced my feet to move, one step at a time, until I was standing outside Sarah's bedroom door. I knocked lightly, and her faint voice called out, Come in. When I stepped inside, I barely recognized her. She was sitting on the edge of the bed, wearing an oversized hoodie and leggings. Her hair was pulled into a messy knot, and her face was pale and tired. Her eyes were red, like she'd been crying for hours. Hey, I said softly. She looked up at me, her lips trembling. You actually came. I'm here, I said, staying near the doorway. Linda said you weren't doing well. She let out a hollow laugh. That's an understatement. For a while, neither of us said anything. The silence hung heavy between us, broken only by the faint sounds of Liam babbling downstairs. Eventually, Sarah spoke. I thought coming back would fix everything, she said quietly. I thought if I could just see you, if I could just explain, maybe I could undo what I did. You can't undo it, Sarah, I said. You made your choice. She nodded, tears slipping down her cheeks. I know, but I've been living with that choice every day, and it's killing me. There was something raw in her voice, something I hadn't heard before. She wasn't trying to manipulate me, wasn't trying to guilt me. She was just broken. I'm not here to fix you, I said after a long pause. I can't do that, Sarah. You have to fix yourself. She nodded again, wiping at her face with the sleeve of her hoodie. I don't know how. Start small, I said. Take care of your son. Take care of yourself. Stop waiting for someone else to save you. She looked down at her hands, her shoulders shaking as she cried silently. I didn't move closer. I didn't try to comfort her. I just stood there, letting her feel it, letting her face the consequences of everything that had led her here. Eventually, I turned and walked out of the room. Linda met me at the bottom of the stairs, her expression a mix of gratitude and sadness. Thank you, James, she whispered. I nodded, gave Liam one last glance, and walked out the door. As I sat in my car, I let out a long breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. Sarah wasn't my responsibility anymore. Her pain, her regrets, her mess. It wasn't mine to carry. And for the first time in years, I felt free. Completely, undeniably free. The weeks after seeing Sarah at her parents' house felt strange. Not in a gut-wrenching, all-consuming way like before, but in a dull, lingering ache that crept in when things got quiet. I kept telling myself that I'd done the right thing by walking away, that her mess wasn't mine to clean up. But there were still moments where I'd catch myself thinking about her. About the broken woman sitting on that bed, clutching the pieces of her shattered life, staring at me like I was the last lifeboat on a sinking ship. But I wasn't her lifeboat. I wasn't anything to her anymore, and that realization gave me a kind of peace, even if it was bitter. Life went on. Work was steady. The gym became part of my routine again, and I started going out more with friends, grabbing drinks, catching a movie, anything to keep myself from slipping back into those endless loops of what-if scenarios. Some nights, though, I'd lie in bed and wonder if Sarah was doing any better, if she was taking care of Liam, if she'd started picking up the pieces of her life. But I never reached out. I refused to let myself get pulled back into her orbit. It was a Tuesday afternoon when I got the next call. I was at work, halfway through drafting an email, when my phone buzzed. It was Linda. For a moment, I just stared at the screen. Every instinct told me not to answer, to let it go to voicemail, but something made me pick up. James. Linda's voice was thin and shaky. I'm sorry to bother you at work, but it's Sarah. She's in the hospital. I froze. The words hit me like ice water down my spine. What happened? She collapsed this morning. They think it might be exhaustion, malnutrition. I don't know. She hasn't been taking care of herself. They're running tests now, but I thought you should know. There was a long silence. I could hear Linda crying softly on the other end of the line. Do you need me to come? I asked finally. No, she said quickly. No, you don't need to do that. I didn't know who else to call. We said our goodbyes and I hung up. I sat there staring at my desk, my computer screen still glowing with the half-written email in front of me. My stomach was in knots, and I couldn't focus on anything else. Over the next couple of days, Linda kept me updated. Sarah had been severely dehydrated and malnourished. Her body had just given up on her. Linda said she'd been refusing help, refusing food some days, and spending hours locked in her room. It wasn't hard to see what had happened. Sarah had unraveled completely, and no one had been able to stop it. I didn't visit her in the hospital. I thought about it, sure. I even drove by a couple of times, parked outside, and stared at the entrance. But every time I reached for the door handle, I stopped myself. I told myself it wasn't my place, that seeing her again wouldn't fix anything, for her or for me. About a week later, Linda called again to tell me Sarah had been discharged. She was back home, but things weren't much better. Linda and her husband were still taking care of Liam, while Sarah barely left her room. James, I don't know what to do anymore, Linda said through tears. She won't talk to me. She won't eat. It's like she's already given up. I didn't know what to say. What was I supposed to do with that information? I wasn't her husband anymore. I wasn't her savior. I was just the guy she left behind. But as much as I told myself I wasn't responsible for her, I couldn't shake the guilt. I couldn't stop imagining her sitting alone in that room, staring at the walls, slipping further and further away. So, one evening, I found myself driving back to their house. I didn't tell Linda I was coming. I just showed up, parked on the street, and knocked on the door. Linda answered, and when she saw me, her face crumpled with relief. James, thank you for coming. She led me upstairs, stopping outside Sarah's door. She's inside. I'll give you some space. I knocked softly before pushing the door open. Sarah was sitting on the floor by the window, her knees pulled up to her chest. She was wearing the same oversized hoodie I'd seen her in weeks ago, and her hair was a tangled mess around her face. She didn't even look up when I walked in. Sarah, I said quietly. She flinched, like hearing my voice physically hurt her. Slowly, she turned her head to look at me. Her eyes were hollow, sunken, and glassy. You came, she said weakly. I nodded. Linda called me. She's worried about you. Sarah let out a dry, humorless laugh. She shouldn't be. I'm fine. You're not fine, I said bluntly. Look at yourself, Sarah. Look at where you are. She turned her face away, staring back out the window. I don't know how to fix this, James. I don't know how to be okay again. For a moment, I didn't say anything. I just stood there, taking in the sight of her. This broken version of the woman I had once loved so deeply. You have a son downstairs, I said finally. He needs you, Sarah. He needs his mother. You can't keep shutting yourself away like this. Her shoulders started to shake, and I realized she was crying. I don't deserve him. I don't deserve anything. I sighed and ran a hand through my hair. Listen to me. You can't change what happened. You can't undo the choices you made. But you can start over. You can be better, for him, if not for yourself. She looked back at me, her face streaked with tears. Do you hate me? The question hit me hard, but I answered honestly. No, Sarah. I don't hate you, but I can't save you. You have to want to save yourself. For the first time in what felt like forever, something shifted in her expression. It was small, barely noticeable, but it was there. A spark, a flicker of something resembling hope. I stood there for a while longer, letting her cry, letting her process whatever was going on in her head. When I finally turned to leave, she said softly, "Thank you, James." I nodded and walked out of the room, closing the door quietly behind me. Linda met me at the bottom of the stairs, and I told her, "She's still in there, somewhere, but she has to want to come back." Linda hugged me tightly, and I left the house feeling more drained than I had in years. I didn't know if Sarah would pull herself together, or if she'd keep slipping further away. But as I drove home that night, I realized it wasn't my burden to carry anymore. I had done everything I could. The rest was up to her. In the weeks after I visited Sarah, I tried to let it all go. I reminded myself, over and over, that her problems weren't mine to fix. I wasn't her husband anymore. I wasn't responsible for picking up the pieces of her life, no matter how much her mother cried on the phone or how hollow Sarah's voice sounded when she asked if I hated her. I had done what I could. I'd said my piece. It was supposed to be over. But even knowing that, I couldn't shake the feeling of unease sitting heavy in my chest. Every time my phone buzzed, I'd brace myself for another call from Linda, expecting the worst. Every night, I'd lie awake, staring at the ceiling, wondering if Sarah was actually making an effort to change, or if she was still sitting on that floor by the window, wasting away while her parents raised her son downstairs. One Saturday morning, while I was at the gym, I got another text from Linda. "She's doing better, James. Slowly, but she's trying. Thank you for talking to her. I think it made a difference." I read the message 3 times, waiting for the relief to hit me. It didn't, not fully, but it was something. I texted back a simple, "I'm glad to hear that," and left it at that. Time passed. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months. The world kept moving, and I kept trying to move with it. Sarah became less and less of a constant shadow in my mind. I focused on myself, on my job, my health, my friendships. For the first time in years, my life felt like it was truly mine. But then, one afternoon, I ran into her. It was at a small coffee shop downtown. I was standing in line, scrolling through my phone, when I heard a familiar voice behind me ordering tea. My body froze, my stomach clenched, and when I turned around, there she was. Sarah was standing a few feet away, holding Liam in her arms. She looked better, healthier. Her hair was clean and tied back neatly. Her clothes were casual but well kept, and there was a light in her eyes that I hadn't seen in, God, years. Liam, now a little older, was playing with the zipper on her jacket, babbling softly to himself. She noticed me almost immediately, and her eyes went wide. For a moment, we just stared at each other. Then she gave me a small, hesitant smile. "James," she said softly. I nodded. "Hey, Sarah." There was an awkward silence, filled only with the sound of the espresso machine and distant chatter from the other tables. Finally, she cleared her throat. "How have you been?" "Good," I said honestly. "I've been good." She nodded and glanced down at Liam, adjusting him on her hip. That's good to hear." Neither of us seemed to know what to say next. It was strange, standing there with her like this, in such a normal, mundane setting, after everything that had happened. "Do you want to sit down for a minute?" she asked cautiously, like she was afraid I'd say no. I hesitated, but eventually nodded. Sure. We found a small table in the corner. Liam was in a high chair, happily munching on a cracker while Sarah and I sat across from each other. Up close, I could see just how much she had changed. There were faint lines around her eyes, and she looked tired, but not in the hollow, defeated way she had before. This was different. It was the tiredness of someone who was trying, someone who was fighting her way back to something better. I'm surprised to see you, she said quietly. I didn't think I'd ever run into you again. I didn't think so either, I admitted. There was another pause, but it didn't feel as heavy this time. I'm doing better, she said finally. I've been going to therapy. I got a part-time job, just something small at a bookstore, but it's something. And I'm trying, James. Really trying. I nodded, taking in her words. That's good, Sarah. I'm glad to hear that. She smiled faintly, and her eyes filled with something. Gratitude, maybe, or relief. I wanted to thank you for what you said to me that day. I know you didn't have to come see me, and you definitely didn't have to care, but you did. And I think it saved me. I didn't know how to respond to that, so I just nodded. She glanced at Liam, who was now making a mess of the cracker crumbs on the table. He's the reason I keep going. I look at him, and I know I can't let myself fall apart again. We sat there in silence for a moment, watching Liam babble happily to himself. Do you regret it? I asked suddenly, the question slipping out before I could stop it. Do you regret leaving? Sarah looked down at her hands, her smile fading. Every day. Her voice cracked slightly, but she held herself together. I regret it every single day, James. And I know I can't change what I did. I can't take it back. But I'm trying to make sure the rest of my life isn't defined by that mistake. I leaned back in my chair, letting her words sink in. There was something about the way she said it. Something raw, something real, that made me believe her. We didn't talk much more after that. Just small talk, casual questions about work and life. Eventually, Sarah said she needed to get going. Liam was starting to get fussy, and she had errands to run. As she stood up and adjusted Liam on her hip, she hesitated for a moment. James, I don't expect you to forgive me, and I'm not asking for anything from you, but I hope you can find peace with everything someday. You deserve that. I nodded. You too, Sarah. She smiled softly, then turned and walked out of the coffee shop. I watched her go, Liam's little head resting on her shoulder as they disappeared down the street. When I walked back to my car, I felt something I hadn't felt in years, closure. Real, genuine closure. Not because everything had been tied up in a neat little bow, but because I finally understood that some things don't get fixed. Some wounds don't heal perfectly, but you can still move forward. Sarah had made her choice, and I had made mine. And for the first time since she walked out of my life, I felt free. Really, truly free.